So now we'll go ahead and bring our moderator in, our own Tom Noonan. Tom, thank you for agreeing to moderate this just incredibly interesting speaker with us today, Mike Cote, in what is literally a fireside chat. So I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Cannon, and good to have everyone together. Thanks for joining us today for our fireside chat. I'm Tom Noonan, as Cannon mentioned, a Rotary Atlanta member and longtime technology and cybersecurity entrepreneur here in Atlanta. But our real honored guest today, Mike Cote, is the Chief Executive Officer of Secureworks, which is a truly world leader in cybersecurity solutions that's headquartered here in Atlanta, which is fantastic. And while many of you don't know Secureworks, it is a company that protects and defends the cyber infrastructure of some of the largest and most complex business and government enterprises in the world. So Mike, longtime friend, it's great to have you join us at Rotary today, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate the opportunity, and did notice the wine bottles you have behind you for the next fireside chat.
Yeah, I think my location today in my office is displaying some of the trophies that have been earned over 30 years in business. They're large. So let's get right into it. For the next 30 minutes, we're going to take you on a tour of the dark world of the cyber underground and shed some light on why cybercrime is such a lucrative business. And we'll also touch on who these bad actors are and what treasure they seek. We'll touch on some of the methods of their tradecraft, how the fear of the COVID pandemic is being exploited, and some thoughts about our upcoming elections and how you can protect yourselves and your companies to reduce risk. But let's be clear, our adversaries and strategic competitors will increasingly use cyber capabilities, including cyber espionage, attack, influence operations, and other methods to gain a political, economic, or military advantage over the United States and our allies. China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and others increasingly use cyber operations to poison both our minds and our machines in an expanding number of ways. To steal information, influence our citizens, or disrupt critical infrastructure. At present, China and Russia probably pose the greatest espionage and cyber attack threat, but we anticipate that all our adversaries and strategic competitors are going to increasingly build and integrate cyber espionage, attack, and influence capabilities into their efforts to influence our policy and national security interests. In the last decade, our adversaries and competitors have developed and experimented with really a growing capability to shape and alter the information and the systems on which we rely. For years, they've conducted cyber espionage. I think we're all, aware of that, to collect intelligence and target our infrastructure. But they are now becoming much more adept at using social media to alter how we think, how we behave, and how we decide, which is frightening. As we connect and integrate these billions of new digital devices into our lives and our business processes, adversaries and strategic competitors will almost certainly gain greater insight and access to our protected information. So with that as our stage, let's jump right into this, Mike, with perhaps one of the most obvious questions that I'm sure many of our audience are wondering, which is, why is this happening? Given all the investment that's gone into cyber defense and all the years we fought this, are we ever going to eliminate cybercrime? Is there a simple way to solve this?
Yeah, Tom, I think you did a great job setting it up. And I'd actually say that you and I have both made a living from an industry, or a good living over the last few years from an industry that I believe is the only industry in modern times that has not made progress in the last 20 years. And I think if you look at some of the instances around the city of Atlanta and around the world, you can see that there continues to be a lot of progress that the bad guys or threat actors are making for a host of reasons. And I think the root causes of these problems are the first, that there's a lot of old human code. The humans are the ones writing the code, the software that runs all the systems that we're operating on. There's a lot of old code operating, especially as we're getting into the Internet of Things and moving to manufacturing facilities and other facilities. And in addition, since it's humans writing code, it will be flawed to start with. So we've got a attack surface expanding. We've got the fact that this is not, even though we all think about it as a technology problem, it's not necessarily a technology problem. It's threat actors using technology as their method of attack. So needing to think about it in a different manner. And some of it actually is not even cyber as we think of cyber, meaning they will get your login IDs and your credentials. I actually have an example I can go through in a little while that'll talk about how our threat actors have gained access to systems in a legitimate manner. So is there a simple way to solve this problem? No. Clearly, it's getting more and more complex as each day goes by, as there's more systems on the internet. I don't think we'll ever eliminate cybercrime. And I actually think in my first statement, until the cybersecurity community begins to come together to solve this problem as a community, to fight the threat actors, we're gonna continue to lose ground in the process.
That's an interesting perspective, Mike, because 20 years ago, we thought about this problem as malcontent kids on skateboards just wanting to cause a little disruption. And today it's obviously grown, and the internet is experiencing exploding growth. How big is this problem, and why does it seem to be just getting bigger and bigger?
The global cybersecurity market today is estimated to be about $150 billion and growing rapidly. And I think it's growing rapidly for a host of reasons. One is the expansion of devices that are connected, whether it's your car, whether it's your home system. Everything, quite frankly, is getting more and more connected. And if you look, I've said over time, if you look to put a new device on the internet, it's typically scanned by someone somewhere in the world within minutes to decide whether they want to look to penetrate it or not. So we've got an expanding system of connected devices. We've got threat actors that work very well together, and it's a profitable event. Ransomware in the second quarter of this year, in the last fiscal quarter that was just ended, the take by ransomware threat actors went up 47% over the first quarter. I was actually having a discussion with somebody recently in a small school system up in the Northeast, not the one that came out over the weekend with regard to the Virginia school system, but a small one up in the Northeast, basically had a ransomware attack and paid $10,000 quickly to get out of it. So I think there's an ability to make a lot of money in this process. There's also, different threat actor groups. You've got nation state governments that are looking after gathering information, or the espionage you referred to earlier. You've got organized crime groups around the world that are looking to get money. You've got the individuals that you mentioned that are still out there, and you've got hacktivism groups that have causes they're trying to fight for. And all of these groups work, as I mentioned, very, very well together. I actually think that until we change the way, as I mentioned, we go about this from cybersecurity professionals, we're going to have a real hard time making progress in the industry.
Yeah, it's obviously a growing problem. The criminals are becoming far more coordinated. And, if you think about these bad actors, what do they really seek to gain? They're after much more than disruptions. And, what are their methods that they're using? I mean, do you have any war stories you can share with us?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So let me go through a couple of the examples of what they're looking to gather. Most of the nation state actors that you mentioned, the Chinas, the Russias, the Irans, for example, and there are others, are looking to gain intellectual property for the most part. But I've actually got a pretty interesting example where it's economic activity too, from a Chinese perspective. There's actually a very interesting book the last time I was at Fort Meade that they recommended I read, and I'm going to put a little plug in for it, called The 100-Year Marathon. It really talks about the long game and the activity that can happen. Some of it relates to cyber, but I think it's really good to understanding how things can operate. I actually have an example of how China, we believe, is trying to corner the sugar market. And I'll go through that in a few minutes. We also talked a few minutes ago about influence of elections and influencing the way governments operate around the world. And then you've got the monetary aspect of it, most of which has been relating to ransomware lately, because it's been so easy on the way people can get on a network and download their activity from a phishing perspective, or getting somebody's credentials and then beginning to lock down certain systems and then be on the network for typically 3 to 6 months before they execute a plan, and will often end up collecting money. In most instances, people pay. Actually, you and I were talking the other day about the Blackbaud example, which I think is a fascinating one. But let me go through the sugar. You asked for a case study. One of the things, and this is an interesting deal, where our research team, which basically sets up honeypots on the internet to monitor activity and look across our customer base, and we've got about 4,000 customers in about 60 countries around the world. And we saw some Chinese malware that was out there, and it was really identified and attacking some businesses in Myanmar and in Vietnam. And what we found as we got into it was this started with a USB drive. So somebody in those organizations in those countries had put a USB on the network, which allowed the Chinese to gain access into the system. And through that, they were really trying to focus on food production, and in particular, sugar production and the imports and exports. So they were monitoring companies that were importing sugar and the way it was being grown around the world. We believe it was their intent to basically figure out a way to become less reliant on sugar imports, and have worked with our customers in particular, and some that we've disclosed this data to, on how China was really trying to get activity and sort of manipulate things. We've seen the same thing, by the way, in the oil industry from Russia and the Russian government.
Really, really, really interesting to see how much emphasis nation states are putting on the exploitation of this global network of networks for economic advantage. And I think that's a great example. And one of the things that we've increasingly seen as a real issue in society is our dependence on social media. The fact that we get most of our news from social media or online outlets today, which has, created the term fake news, which didn't exist when I was a kid. It certainly didn't exist before the internet. But our adversaries can increasingly use social media and fake news to debase our trust in each other and our institutions, whether there are financial institutions, our government institutions, our academic institutions. How big of a problem is this when you think about influence operations?
It's big. It's really big. Actually, I think there's a lot of data that's come out recently on the impact that Russia, China, and Iran are looking to have on the election, for example, to tie back into the election. And actually, if you go back to the 2016 election, it came out that Hillary's election headquarters had been hacked. And it's interesting, we actually were involved in finding that, although I have to claim that the FBI actually found it before we did. But it was the Russians who had hacked into Hillary's campaign. And the FBI actually had called Hillary's campaign to tell them they didn't believe the FBI for whatever the reasons are. But I think last week, for example, move into this year's election in 2020, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal that the Russian government hackers have targeted 2 different groups tied to the 2020 elections, and by groups that are on social media accounts. And they said in the article that it's basically 200 is not the full scope of all of the social media outlets or groups on those outlets that have been targeted, and all of the attacks were successful attacks. The interesting thing is that they believe that Russians are sort of pushing more towards President Trump, and the Chinese and Iranians are pushing more towards former Vice President Biden. So it'll be interesting to watch how this whole thing plays out and how much fake news actually, if you will, gets sort of generated during the problem. And I think, by the way, part of this problem, and it ties into the earlier problem I talked about a moment ago, is there's a shortage, as you well know, Tom, of cybersecurity people of somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million individuals today.
Yep.
So, the ability to try and control this and really get around it is a hard thing I think it's impossible with where we sit today. And the days of the news as we once knew, the Walter Cronkite, where it was true news, quite frankly, don't exist anymore. And as I read over the weekend, a quote that, it's a fact that there's a lot of fiction out there. And I think, quite frankly, there's probably more fiction out there than there is fact today as we deal with this.
Yep. Yeah. And it's not clear to any of us how much of that fiction is being injected into our applications like Facebook, Twitter, and others that have literally, hundreds of millions of followers. And it's frightening to think about how effective a propaganda campaign can be.
Yeah, Tom, I'd be curious to your opinion. My view is that I read everything and assume it's not true rather than it's true for the things on social media in particular.
Yeah, that's one of the ways the internet has hardened me over the last 10 years. Seeking the truth is often like finding a needle in the haystack. But it's interesting, Mike, when I was on the NSA advisory board, we did some tabletop exercises just to demonstrate how social media could be used to create kinetic conflict, a la, the Russians have moved in and taken over a piece of Latvia. And, you watch how things unfold when, the truth has not been assessed. And it can be really, really dangerous. And I think, when you think about this, one of the most frequent questions I get is, who are these people? Who's actually doing this? Is it coordinated? Is it lone wolves? So when you think about it, I think it would be great for our Rotary Atlanta members to know kind of what the threat actors are and what do they look like, and who are these perpetrators?
Yeah, I think, look, I made a comment at the beginning of this that I made at a board meeting a while ago, and folks are sort of sitting back and saying, you got to be kidding me. Do you really think this is the only industry in modern time that has not made progress? And the answer is yes. And I think, by the way, one of the problems is that, and one of the proof points, let me give you the proof points of the problem. One of the proof points is the fact that there is no dominant security company. And for an industry that's 25 or 30 years old, in every other industry, somebody has 25, 30, 35%, 40% market share.
Yep.
Anytime a cybersecurity company gets to be $2, $3, $4 billion in cybersecurity, it seems too dependent on old technology, quite frankly, that is no longer relevant. So as the threat actors keep changing, I think the most important part of this is, to answer your question, are they lone wolves? Are they nation states? They're all of the above. They're all of the ones listed on this slide, but they also work very, very well in a coordinated, orchestrated fashion, understanding what part of the various ecosystem they play. So if I gave a specific kind of baseline example, we study, I've got about 200 people that are in the counter threat unit that study threat actors and their tactics, techniques, and procedures around the world. And one of the ones that we study, that I give the example of mainly because Bill McDermott, when he was the CEO of SAP, was on our board, and I used to sort of have fun with Bill, but there's a threat actor in Singapore that writes hacking code to hack into SAP. And this individual has been doing it. He sells it on the website that is the eBay of hacking code. And he sells it for rent, or he sells it for where somebody can buy it. And if Tom Noonan buys it or rents it, he then could distribute it on the botnet distribution website, which is 76.summer probably right now. I don't think they flip to the 76.fall as they market themselves and kind of rebrand themselves each season.
Yeah.
And then as you well know, everybody knows, Bitcoin, eGold, Easy Money are the types of ways that those guys can exchange and make money in what they're doing. So it's much more coordinated, it's much more organized, it's much more structured than we are on the good guy side of this, and they're better funded, in particular by the nation state governments.
Yeah.
And the things that they want to do. So it really is a wide variety of people that get involved in this. They work with each other. And by the way, it's very easy to become a hacker.
Right. Well, it's really interesting because the news, which I think is in this particular case news and not fake news, recently has, highlighted the fact that the race for a COVID-19 vaccine has brought some of the nastiest, dirtiest adversaries in the world, to America's front door because of our proficiency with immunology and virology and our ability to create the solutions to this through a inoculation, to a vaccine, et cetera. And so all of a sudden, COVID-19 itself has been part of the, has become used to target ways to break into companies. And you and I were talking about this earlier, and I thought some of the stories you were telling were fascinating. And so maybe you share a little bit about COVID-19.
Yeah, happy to, Tom. I think the first thing is, this is the first event in history that has brought the cybersecurity community together. In other words, instead of picking on somebody's tax infrastructure or, the individual in Nigeria where they've taken your person hostage or whatever it is, COVID-19 has all of the threat actors focused on trying to get credentials and access to systems through the same vector of all of us focused on, whether it's individuals or businesses, the fear relating to COVID-19. So we've seen websites that have been set up where you have to register that are fake websites for states that you may be traveling to. We actually were engaged in a situation with the US and the UK governments who have highlighted the amount of back-end espionage that's being targeted against US organizations. And we were engaged in an incident response engagement. And what was really notable about the incident response engagement, it was an incident response engagement relating to a pharmaceutical company, is that the company had two-factor authentication, to get to the two-factor authentication example that was brought up earlier. But the adversary accessed the system with proper two-factor authentication, went straight to the organization's SharePoint servers, and downloaded two files that had been set up relating to COVID-19 vaccine development, the trials, all of the documentation relating to the supply chain vendors, and the global address book of the organization. And we believe the global address book was basically so that they could target companies within the company or employees within the company to be able to gather further information long term. We also believe, but we've not been able to go through attribution, and this is an ongoing investigation, but that they had a couple of individuals on the inside who are no longer with the organization, who may have been paid off to kind of gain access and put everything in a single place. So this, I'll say, threat actor could gain the types of data and information they were looking for easily and quickly, and be able to get out of the organization quickly. So it's a little scary relating to kind of the whole push from a vaccine perspective, and the amount of activity that's going on in the cyber world.
Just amazing. I mean, whenever anything of value appears, it all of a sudden becomes interested to the adversaries. And this is an area that clearly we're investing, billions of dollars of research into. And, I guess it's not surprising. One of the things that I have seen in a number of my companies is the fact that phishing emails indicating, novel information about coronavirus that everyone wants to hear, they're clicking on them. It's taking them to sites, inserting malware, and, it's just crazy. And if you think Martha had talked about, our get out the vote and the issues we had with our election this year, and, we're 7 or 8 weeks away from an election. You gave an example of Hillary's campaign being hacked. We certainly had our issues here in Georgia with new technology and new procedures. Any 2020 election foreign influence or hacking that you've come about that you can share with the group?
Yeah, so we actually have an individual who in our research team who focuses all of his time, including his free time, because he feels so passionate about the elections and the election process. He's been doing this for years, actually testing systems for free and trying to help vendors find vulnerabilities. And I think this falls into a couple of different buckets. One would be disinformation, as we've talked about. And I mentioned the Wall Street Journal article that came out, I think it was on the 10th last week. The Department of Homeland Security actually issued a report on foreign influence that they expect from operators in Russia and China and Iran, and trying to push the various candidates, or at least confuse things. But I imagine they're really trying to push things in a certain perspective. Facebook has come out and said that they've taken down some of the groups and the pages that they believe are associated with the Russian research organization or the Russian FSB, and the way that they're trying to push it. But I think this, coupled with the pandemic, makes it even more difficult because I think the COVID-19 has a couple of different threats to this. One is the new technology that we talked about that's being implemented, and the safety and security of that new technology. I think the second is the modified operations and procedures for voting, whether that's by mail or being able to process the bulk mail that comes through. And the opportunity to remotely probe either into the systems beforehand or in transmission when the data is being sent up is going to be pretty interesting, which I think will end up creating delays in the counting cycle, unless this is a landslide one way or another, which will add to the uncertainty and the difficulty and an impact on the country overall, I believe. So, any change that we are doing in the process, in the infrastructure, we saw some of it earlier, but I think is adding an exponential attack vector and a difficulty for the hackers to, an easy point of view, and for the hackers to go after, and a difficulty for us to figure out how to make sure that not only the systems and processes work, but that there is a sense of trust and belief that it's being done properly. We actually, one of the county governments in Atlanta that we work with, or I should say in Georgia that we work with, as we talk to them, basically said that they are really concerned, have top security concerns around disinformation and around ransomware happening in the midst of the voting process, the voter registration database being tampered with, or physical threats at the locations, at polling locations.
Yeah,
right? There could, through the social media, cause issues with people showing up to vote. from a physical threat that could come out. So it's going to be a very interesting process this year. I really applaud what's being done to try and push this in Georgia, as Martha talked about earlier. But I think we all should be vigilant in the way we go about trying to ensure and provide any assistance we can, which, quite frankly, we're trying to do across parts of Georgia.
Yep. Really good points, Mike. And I already see the private chat system lighting up with lots of questions about, what would you recommend I do to protect myself? What can we do? So with all the fear, uncertainty, and doubt about this, what recommendations would you have for our members about managing their own protection, both personally and at their business enterprises?
So I'm going to touch on a few, and I think, Tom, you've got a screen on the corporate front, and then I'll touch on the individual. Look, I think the most important part is training employees and recognize phishing scams and phishing campaigns, including malicious messages and emails, continuous testing of employees, whether it's testing them from a phishing perspective or testing from a tabletop perspective, and acceptance, by the way, of the fact that we're humans and people are going to make mistakes. I actually, 2 Saturdays ago, clicked on a phishing link personally on a Saturday morning before I got into my second cup of coffee. Had to call into the office and say, made the mistake. They took me off the internet quickly. I had to change all my passwords. I don't know. I didn't enter any of that information, but just the fact that I clicked on it caused a real level of concern. And they began to watch all the activity on my corporate network, after that. So I think being vigilant with regard to the way you're handling all that, using virtual private networks as you connect to the internet, 2-factor authentication we mentioned earlier, which is really important. From a personal perspective, I would say activate 2-factor authentication wherever possible. Do not, in addition to using 2-factor authentication, do not use the same password for all of your various systems. Put banking and sensitive information on a separate device. If they hack the computer that you're on, and the longer you're on the internet, the more likely they're going to get it. The question is, do you really care on what is there? And then I would be, for those that are involved, actually, I mentioned Blackbaud earlier. I know, Tom, you and I on a separate organization were involved in an instance there. It's been a very interesting situation. So for those who are not aware, Blackbaud, who does a lot of work in the not-for-profit world, announced a couple of months ago that they were hacked, and actually they were hacked a little earlier than they announced it. And this is how kind of the whole phishing and ransomware game has changed. It used to be they would lock your systems to see whether you paid or didn't pay, and then they'd exit. Either when you paid or if you didn't pay, they'd leave your systems locked. Now what we found is that they're actually stealing data so that they can prove to you that they've stolen and have access to your systems. If you pay the ransom, they are saying they're deleting the data, but you have no proof that that's the case. So for those of you that have given money or gotten notifications on Blackbaud, typically it's 2 years later that they will try and phish you. So it's not right up front. So I would tell you to be careful, understanding that you could be phished specifically if you've been giving to organizations from a Blackbaud perspective and anything you may do. And then the last thing from a personal perspective that I think is most important is to freeze your credit. If you have your credit frozen, because in most cases, if people go after somebody personally, they're going after you for monetary reasons. Your credit's frozen, they can't get a credit card or do anything along those lines.
Thank you, Mike. Really, really good input. Staying safe on this information highway is a full contact sport. This is a dangerous place, and there are lots and lots of adversaries that are out there. And you just don't know. My rule of, I delete so much email. I figure if it's legitimate, at some point, someone will call me, or they'll keep sending me emails to the point where I wonder whether it's legitimate or not. But as you know, phishing has become, a true art form, kind of a science. And it's the number one vector for access to business enterprises. and to personal, information.
I agree, Tom, especially because what they're doing now is they're getting access to systems so they really look real. They look like you're the CFO, or they look like somebody really connected to you.
Yep. Well, Mike, listen, let me be the first to thank you for joining us today and for taking time out of your busy schedule. Continued good luck with the growth and success of Secureworks. It's a very important Atlanta technology company, and all of us at Rotary Atlanta certainly appreciate you joining us today for this great discussion. Cannon, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thanks, Tom, and Mike. Thank you very much. Actually, if you have time for maybe two more questions, I can fire them at you, one from the floor and one from myself. But both Mike and Tom, both of you just organized an incredibly insightful and practical guide to the dark world of cybersecurity. So thank you both very much. So, and Mike, by the way, it's helpful and reassuring to know that you fell for it too, so recently, because, I occasionally I'll fall for it and I'm like, gosh, man, I feel like I'm informed. And yet, it's so easy to have that happen. On the online voting, just out of curiosity, I mean, how close are we to having a safe and secure process to rely on there?
That's a really difficult question to answer because it's done in all 50 states differently. And there's not been a standard, at least that I'm aware of, around all of the systems. We've been trying to work with the various systems, but I'll tell you, if it's of interest, be happy to get some information from our cyber researcher that's focused purely on the voting systems and pass it along to the group. So I can, if it's of interest, I can send it over to Tom and you guys can figure out if you want to send it through the membership.
Yeah, it might be really interesting to get that to Martha, given what she and Eric and Michelle and others are doing with the voting initiative. That might be an interesting dimension of their work, Cannon.
I agree. I think so. Mike, if you want to have a look and send it to Tom, and then Tom, you can decide kind of how to send it over to Martha or me. That'd be wonderful. I think that could help.
Make sure I'm not being fished.
Right. And then, Mike, you talked about how in this day and age, we're behind from the good guys' perspective, and we need better integrated approach, better ecosystem in a way. And it's interesting because the way you describe it, it sounds like the bad guys they're better. They're not necessarily better technology. They're just better ecosystem, better structure, better funding. What do we learn from them, and what do we need to do? So if you're looking 5 years from now and we're succeeding, what does a coordinated, integrated effort look like?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I'll tell you, I think the problem we have today in the cybersecurity world is that we're all differentiating on our technology, meaning I'll say the plumbing. And one of the things, actually, you give me an advertisement for about 3.5 years ago, we started creating a cloud native platform that our goal is basically to, I'll say in quotes, give it to the good guys, where we can effectively be able to differentiate for our customers on our intellectual property. So if Tom has, two companies that are focused in cybersecurity and they've got great intellectual property about how to detect or prevent the bad guys or respond rapidly, then it shouldn't be the plumbing aspect of that technology that's differentiated. It should be the intellectual property that's contained in it, the algorithms, the analytics, the machine learning. So somehow we've got to figure out a way in the community to share that data across for the betterment of our customers. Today, if we were going in to try and sell you something, Tom and I would both be trying to get a piece of your pocketbook rather than us coming in together and saying, how can we collectively together help you as our customer at the end of the day? And I really think it's going to take a fundamental shift of senior executives to realize we have to do what's in our best interest of the customers, and where we're going to make a difference is with the intellectual property we have.
Yep.
So is that like a self-created association that sits on top and kind of keeps it organized, or
Actually, what we have is we've got a platform that is connected in and has APIs and an open framework to all of the various security products that exist. And effectively, what we're trying to say is, if you want access to it, we're going to give people access to it. We're not trying to create something that's proprietary. We want to keep it out of the bad guys' hands, or keep them from getting on the platform. but we really want to allow people to write their intellectual property, their machine learning to detect something bad, for example, and monetize that in an open system.
Well, fascinating. Well, thank you again. Incredible insights from both of you. And this was just a fantastic educational program. And like I said, practical to kind of help us navigate it even ourselves. So thank you both very much.
Great. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.